Hi everybody, Shannon and Karen with Wandering Out Yonder, and today we are in Pine Grove Furnace State Park with another segment of our series about the Appalachian Trail Museum and the community that surrounds it. And I just have to say to start off that it is an absolutely huge, wonderful, warm community that we're finding. So today we are here to meet and listen to a presentation from Mills Kelly, who has a podcast in regards to the Appalachian Trail. He also just came out with a new book
called Virginia's Lost Appalachian Trail.
And this presentation that he's doing today is talking about, I think about a 300-mile span of the Appalachian Trail that was moved in 1952, about 50 miles west from its original location. It's just one story and a long list of stories in regards to the Appalachian Trail. It's always interesting to us. So anyhow, that's what we're doing today, and we hope you guys will come along.
But we'll go ahead and get started, and our speaker today is Mills Kelly.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everybody for coming out on a beautiful Sunday. I'm actually okay with the fact that it got overcast. It could have gotten a little warm and certainly a lot buggier if the sun was out. So I just really appreciate y'all being here. Just a little bit about me. I've been hiking on the AT since 1971, which dates me a little bit. But and my first experiences with the Appalachian Trail were in Shenandoah National Park. I'd grown up in Northern Virginia, and I joined the Boy Scouts when I was 11. And our scoutmaster at the time, Mr. Ballard, still remember, was a Pacific War veteran. He fought his way across the Pacific as a Marine, but he was from California. And so he took us hiking on this trail in Shenandoah National Park, which was called the Appalachian Trail. But Mr. Ballard didn't know anything about the Appalachian Trail, except that it was the closest backpacking trail to where we had our scout meetings. And so we hiked on that trail. And I didn't know it went from Maine to Georgia, because in those days in Shenandoah National Park, there were no signs that said Maine to Georgia, or if there were, we didn't hike past those particular signs. And then in a couple of years after I joined the Boy Scouts, Ed Garvey, who you can see up there in the museum, who lived in the neighborhood with my Boy Scout troop, came to one of our scout meetings and did a slideshow about his through hike from Georgia to Maine. And I just remember thinking, wait, that trail that we go hiking on, it goes from Georgia to Maine? Really?
And back.
And back, right. That's really long. I mean, my family's from Georgia, and I was thinking, like, I could hike to Georgia. That would be kind of cool. I was 12 or 13. So that's how I got started with the AT. And then I went off and did a whole million other things. I've been hiking on the trail off and on ever since. I'm not a through hiker. I'll just put it out there now. I'm a lifetime section hiker, but I'm getting there. And and retirement is like right over there, and so as soon as retirement happens and then I get a new right hip, then I'm going to finish up. So that's my general plan. That's the retirement plan. My wife has condoned this plan, and promises to support me in it. So today I want to tell you a really unusual story about the history of the Appalachian Trail, and it's an example of what happens when you're a historian and you go to an archive. Because if you're a historian, archives are actually pretty dangerous places, because they're full of rabbit holes. And Gwen's laughing because she knows. She knows. And because you're just like doing your research and it's going along fine, and then you turn the page of a pile of documents or a stack of photographs and you see something that you hadn't seen before, and this rabbit hole opens up in front of you. And as a historian, it's your obligation to at least sort of peer down into the hole and see if there's anything interesting down there. Probably 85% of the time, 90% of the time, we just look down in the hole and then we just keep walking, move away from the rabbit hole. What happened to me, though, is that in 2018, I was working in the archives of the ATC, and I just started working on a book that I'm still working on because I got diverted down in that rabbit hole. I began working on a book that I'm loosely calling A Hiker's History of the AT. It's a history of the trail from the hiker perspective rather than from the founder perspective, and from all hikers, not just through hikers. And my principal source for that is the shelter logs, because that's where we know about people who went out and hiked on Saturday and that was their experience on the AT, where they went out for 3 nights or something like that. They wrote things in the shelter logs. They didn't write books about their hike on Saturday. They didn't write books about their 3-day hike, but they did write something in those shelter logs. And so slowly I've been accumulating knowledge of those, of just sort of the average hiker through those shelter logs, which is a lot of reading, but a lot of fun reading. And so I was working in the archives of the ATC just to get started on this history of the Appalachian Trail, and I did the thing that historians often do. I started with the institutional sources, which in the ATC archives were correspondence files. And so I knew a lot about the history of the trail from the passage of the National Scenic Trails Act in 1968, but I didn't know much about the early days of the trail. So I was just reading the 1920s and 1930s correspondence files just to get a sense of what was going on back then when the trail was being built. And so I was in Myron Avery's correspondence, and the legendary early chairman of the ATC. And in 1929, in the summer of 1929, Avery writes a letter to Arthur Perkins, who was at the time the ATC chairman, but was sort of phasing out of that role, and Avery was phasing in. And Avery in this letter says to Perkins, the trail is nearing completion, but we have 2 big problem areas. One of them is Maine. Pretty much the whole state of Maine is a problem, and then southern Virginia, from Roanoke to Damascus, and which is about a 300-mile stretch of the trail. And he said in this letter that southern Virginia was really terra incognita. And one of the reasons for that was that the most recent Corps of Engineers map of that part of the state of Virginia had been done just about 2 decades after the Civil War. So it was hopelessly out of date. And so, this made Avery crazy because he couldn't couldn't look at a good map and figure out what to do. And the second problem was that part of southern Virginia is incredibly rural. And the only town of any size was the furniture manufacturing town of Galax. And I mean, today Galax is still the biggest town in that part of the state and has a population of maybe 2,000 people. But also I would recommend the Old Fiddlers Convention in Galax every August, longest running fiddlers convention in the world. They only took off 2020, that was the only time since 1930 when it started. But so there were no towns there where he could start a trail club. And this is what Avery liked to do. He liked to start trail clubs that would do what he told them to do, because Avery was kind of a control freak, we'll just say. And so he was really puzzled about what to do about southern Virginia. So I read this letter and I thought, okay, well, that's kind of interesting, and then on page 3 of the letter, he starts kind of venting a little bit about, he's really upset because he's gotten a letter from somebody in Floyd, Virginia on my hat, from Floyd, Virginia, which is the county seat of Floyd County, and the town of about 500 people still. And Floyd County is, to give you an idea of how still rural, Floyd County has 1 traffic light right in the middle of downtown Floyd. But he gets a letter from this guy named Shirley Cole in Floyd, Virginia. He was the extension agent for the state in Floyd. And Cole says, I'm a big fan of the Appalachian Trail, and I have figured out a route from Roanoke to Damascus. And attached is sort of the waypoints along that route. Well, this is like Myron Avery's worst nightmare, because he wanted to be fully in control of the route of the trail at all times. And so to have somebody he'd never met in a part of the state he didn't understand, that he'd never been to, tell him this is where the trail should go, well, he has a freak out. And he expresses this to Perkins. We have to do something, because we don't want the local people deciding where the trail should go. Meaning, I'm going to decide where the trail should go. And so he does a very Avery thing. He writes to a guy in Georgia named Roy Osmer, who was a forester in the Georgia Forest Service. And Osmer had the previous year or 2 years earlier, the previous year had plotted out the route of the trail in Georgia. And so he writes to Osmer, and he's like, Roy, I need you to come to Southern Virginia now. And because we've got to get the trail route plotted out before these local folks figure out where it's going to go. We don't want that. Osmer says, sure, happy to do it. as I said yesterday, apparently the Georgia Forest Service would let their employees just take months off without any explanation so they could go like figure out where the Appalachian Trail should go. But so Osmer, he also writes, and can you send me your measuring wheel? The one that's right up there in the museum. And if you know anything about Myron Avery, you won't be surprised to know that he said no. That's his measuring wheel. That was like his proudest possession. And you know, almost every photo of Myron Avery has that measuring wheel in it. It's either in his hand or leaning against a tree, or he's like lifting it up, trying to get to the summit of Katahdin, but because he measured everything. So he arranges for Osmer to get his own measuring wheel and some money. And so Osmer then comes to the Peaks of Otter outside of Lynchburg, which was as far south as the trail had gotten in Virginia. And that's where the measuring wheel is waiting for him. And he then starts walking south, trying to figure out a route that would be better than the one that this guy Shirley Cole has come up with. And so as he's walking south, he makes it for like 2 days, and then he just gets hopelessly lost. And the reason he gets lost is because that route runs right along the edge of the great escarpment of Virginia. There's a plateau there, like Floyd County, for instance. The entire county is above 2,700 feet, I think. But then you get to the edge of the plateau, and it drops about 800 feet down to the Piedmont, and there are water gaps all along the edge of that plateau. And so you're constantly going down into the water gap and up and down and up and down. And Osmer just gets lost. And so he does the one thing Avery really doesn't want him to do. He calls Shirley Cole and says, "Hey, Mr. Cole, I understand you have an idea for where the trail could go. Could you come and show that to me?" And Cole's like, "Sure, I'd love to." And so Cole shows him the route that he had proposed to Avery in the first place. And then Osmer writes this like 11-page single-spaced memo back to Avery saying, "Here's the route where the trail should go," and it's all this sort of detail. And at the very end, he says, "And Mr. Cole was very helpful to me in figuring this out." Like, it's sort of apologetic at the very end. But now it's kind of a done deal. Like, what's Avery going to do? So, well, what Avery did was he immediately drove down. He borrowed a car and had to have somebody drive him because, I don't know if you know this, Myron Avery didn't drive. Did you know that, Larry? Yeah, Myron Avery didn't drive. He made his teenage kids drive him everywhere. There's an oral history in the PATC archives with his youngest son complaining about that. Like, I wanted to go out on the weekends and I had to drive my dad to the trail. It's really annoying. So anyway, Avery gets down there, somebody drives him down, and he scouts out some of that route himself and pronounces it okay. And so then they start putting up trail markers. And if you've been south of Roanoke, Virginia, on the Blue Ridge Parkway, that's where the trail went. The trail was there before the Blue Ridge Parkway because they start putting up trail markers in 1930, and the Blue Ridge Parkway is several years later. And the route that they chose along that escarpment was a very, very old road. It had originally been a Cherokee path, part of the warrior path for the Cherokee, and then it was a colonial era road that went from Philadelphia down into the Carolinas for trade purposes, and then it just became a road that local people called the Ridge Road, but it was largely abandoned in 1930. And so the trail scouts, Osmer and Cole, and then eventually Avery, say, okay, well, this is a good starting point, and we'll use that. And then when the National Park Service decided to build the Blue Ridge Parkway, they said, oh, look, a roadbed, we'll use that. And so then the AT had to move. And so then it did what it does, south of Shenandoah National, in Shenandoah National Park and to the south, kind of zigzag back and forth across the parkway for miles. But so the trail from there, if you visualize for just a minute, the trail as you know it today, most people hike north, but I'm going to ask you to visualize south. So if you start at Roanoke, McAfee Knob is right outside of Roanoke. If you're hiking south, you cross McAfee Knob, and when you get to the highway that's just south of McAfee, where everybody parks these days, instead of continuing off toward Dragon's Tooth, you would instead take a hard left and go down into the Roanoke River Valley, and then hike up and over Poor Mountain, which is on the other side of that valley, and up onto the escarpment of southern Virginia. And then you hiked along the edge of that escarpment for about 75 miles. And then you drop down into the Dan River Gorge, which is the headwaters of the Dan River, which flows off into Albemarle Sound. And that was really one of the most spectacular parts of the whole route, because you came down into the Dan River Gorge, and then up and over something called the Pinnacles of Dan. And as I said yesterday, I've never been able to figure out why it's plural, because there's only one pinnacle, but they called it the Pinnacles for some reason. It was just like a pyramid-shaped mountain dropped into the middle of a gorge. And the trail went up one side and down the other. And there was actually a reasonable trail on the south side, but on the north side, it was just a rock scramble the whole way. And I interviewed Gene Espy in 2019, who hiked through there going north. And I said, Gene, what was it like hiking over the Pinnacles? And he said, oh, I feel like I fell the whole way down. And so, because you could walk up a really reasonable trail on the way up, and then you just sort of tumbled down the other side. In fact, hikers who did hike through there described that as the second most difficult part of the entire AT. You know, Mahoosuc Notch always wins, but then the Pinnacles of Dan, they said, was the second most difficult part. Then you came up out of the Dan River Gorge, and then had to cut right through downtown Galax, the way that the AT used to go right through downtowns in many towns instead of just a few. And then you had to get across the New River. Today, you cross the New River in Pearisburg on the Highway 460 bridge, not very scenic, but convenient. From 1930 to 1952, you crossed on Dixons Ferry. The Dixons family had been maintaining a ferry service across the New River there for over 150 years. And they, 130 years, yeah, 130 years. And the ferry that they used was just a little flat bottom boat that you get in, and they pull you across the river. And they charged you a nickel. That was what it cost, 5 cents. And if you were hiking south, you just went up to the Dixons' back door and knocked, and either Mr. or Mrs. Dixon would pull you across the river. If you were hiking north, you were on the wrong side of the river, and you had to stand, and the New River is at least 100 yards wide there. You had to stand on the far side of the river and jump up and down and shout until somebody at the Dixon house recognized that there was a hiker over there, and then they would pull across, pick you up, and bring you back across again for a nickel. And so I asked Gene about that, and I said, "Do you remember going across on Dixon's Ferry?" "Oh, yeah, I remember that." I said, "How long did you have to shout to get their attention?" He thought about it, and he said, "It was a long time." And then I said, "Well, do you remember anything about the Dixons?" And he said, "Well, yeah, Mrs. Dixon was the one who came and got me, and she was really nice, and she gave me a glass of lemonade, and we sat on the porch for a little bit." And he said there was this little girl that was just peering through the screen door, but she would never come out to talk to us. And he said, "I wanted her to come out. You know, Gene, if you've ever met Gene Espy, he's one of the nicest people on the planet. He just wanted her to come out, you know, and she just wouldn't." I interviewed that little girl in 2019, and shortly after I saw Gene. She's Sally Rakes Dixon, or Sally Dixon Rakes, and she was in her late 70s when I talked to her about it, and I said, "So do you remember the hikers?" And she said, "Well, I remember this one man, he was from Georgia. He was really nice." I said, "Yeah, he remembers you." And he said, "You wouldn't come out." And she kind of chuckled and said, "Well, you know, my father had always told me to stay away from men with beards. Because," now remember, this is 1951, "because if a man had a beard, he was either a hobo or a communist. And so I should stay away from that." And so she said, I wasn't going to go out and talk to that man because, you know, Gene had a beard by then. And so he was terrifying to her. So, anyway, one of the Dixons would get you across the river. You hiked along what used to be a railroad track and now is the New River Trail. And when you got to Billsby Dam, then you hiked up onto Farmer Mountain, which gave you 360-degree views of the New River Valley and off into the Holston River Valley. Just spectacular views up there. And you can still do that. There's a reasonable trail that goes up to the summit of Farmer Mountain. And then you got on Iron Mountain and followed Iron Mountain all the way down to Damascus. So if you want to hike part of the old AT today, then go to Damascus and get on the Iron Mountain Trail and hike to the New River. It's about, 130 miles or so, and you're on the old AT. Yeah.
That's called retroblazing.
Retroblazing, I like that. I had not heard that before. So that's the most extensive retroblaze you can do on the original section of the AT in Southern Virginia, is the Iron Mountain Trail. And there are a few other spots on the east side of the river, but you have to know where they are because none of them are marked. None of them. And so, for instance, if you're on the Blue Ridge Parkway in Floyd County and you come to a turnout where you can see the view of the Piedmont below, it's called the Saddle. And if you go to the Saddle turnout, get out, look off at the view, and then you look to your right, and there's a little trail going up into the trees. That's the old AT. It's not marked in any way, and so if you take that trail up to the top of the ridge, you come to the only shelter that was built in that section of the trail, built by the CCC as they were building the Parkway, and it's still there. It's still solid because, you know, as I said yesterday, the CCC, they liked concrete, so it's concrete and stonework, and it was really solid, and it's still fine. And although a shelter like that would not be allowed today, because the shelter is there's the shelter. It's a beautiful little shelter, and then you go out the front door and you walk about this far and you drop about 800 feet. I mean, it is right on the edge of the cliff. And you know, the ATC, the National Park Service, everybody's insurance agent would have a freak out about this today, but that was just the way they did it. So if you go and you spend the night, put some like rope across the doorway so that you don't go out. So that's the old route of the trail. So that's part of the story that I wanted to tell. You know, part of the story is like how a historian gets lost in the archives and gets diverted, and the other part is the trail, but the old route of the trail. But the real question that you might be wondering is like, but so why did you bother? I mean, it was only the AT from 1930 to 1952. And the reason is that I'm originally from Franklin County, Virginia, affectionately known to the people who live there as the moonshine capital of the world. You can buy the t-shirts, Franklin County, Virginia, moonshine capital of the world. And so I'm originally from there. My father taught at Ferrum College, a little Methodist college in Franklin County. And so I was reading Shirley Cole's description of where the trail should go. He mentioned that it was right along the Floyd-Franklin line. And I thought to myself, you know, the AT doesn't get anywhere near Franklin County. It's like 50 miles to the west. And that's what caused me to jump into that rabbit hole. If I hadn't been from Franklin County, I probably would have just kept going. But it just was enough of a hook for me that I decided to jump in, and the book over there on the table is the result. The third part of the story, though, is all the friends I've made. Because at the end of the 1952 hiking season, the ATC and the Roanoke Club, which was exercising a lot of supervision over that part of the trail, decided we're done with this route. And they had actually sort of been done before the Second World War, and the Second World War derailed everything. But they decided we're going to move the trail to its current location, 50 miles to the west. And the reason, they had two reasons for moving it. One was because it was so rural there in Southern Virginia, they couldn't get trail clubs to stick. Trail club would form and fall apart, form, fall apart. I mean, it was also the Great Depression, and so there was never consistent maintenance of the trail. PATC volunteers would come down for a long weekend in May every year. It was hard to get to Southern Virginia from DC in 1932, and you know, you had to take the train to Roanoke, and you had to hire a bus, and then the bus would take you down. So it was a real pain. And Roanoke Club volunteers would help out sometimes. People from the Carolina Mountain Club would come up from Asheville once in a while to help out. The Forest Service helped out west of the New River, but it was just not consistently maintained. So that was the first problem. And the second thing was more of an opportunity, and that is that the Jefferson National Forest expanded dramatically before the Second World War. And so the leaders of the Roanoke Club said, look, we can move the trail over into the Jefferson National Forest, and it'll put it on federal land with federal protection. The Forest Service will help us out a little more with trail maintenance. So that really just makes a lot more practical sense. So the combination of no trail clubs to advocate for that route and the availability of federal land is why it moved 50 miles to the west. But what didn't happen, what didn't go away, was people's memories of the trail. I mean, remember, 1952 was 71 years ago. And you know, it was a long time. And when I went to that part of the state for the first time as a researcher in the summer of 2019, I just started driving around and trying to figure out like where the trail had gone. And I also reached out to the Floyd Public Library and asked, you know, can I just give a little talk about what I've been learning, and you know, maybe people in the community could come and share any memories they had of the trail. And they said, yeah, sure. You know, they gave me their little meeting room, and so I thought, you know, 10, 12 people might show up. There were like 40 people who came that day. And they all wanted to tell me about how their grandfather used to work on the old Appalachian Trail. Of course, there's the Appalachian Trail. They used to work on the old Appalachian Trail. The trail went across their uncle's property, or my grandmother used to tell stories about taking the 4-H club up to help with the trail, stuff like that. I mean, everybody wanted to tell me some story about how they personally were connected to the Appalachian Trail. And it's really remarkable. We can be a little blasé about it because we're all connected to the trail in some way. But this is a case where the trail was there for 22 years and then it just vanished. It was sort of yanked away by people up in Washington, D.C. and Roanoke. And then it was just gone. And they wouldn't let go. They've never forgotten. And so the trail made such an impact on their personal stories. So I'll just tell you, I told you about Sally, whose family ran the ferry. But I'll tell you about two other people who've just become really good friends of mine. One of them is Ralph Barnard. Ralph is I think Ralph's 85 or 86 this year, and he remembers the hikers because they used to come and stay on his grandfather's farm. He was raised by his grandfather, and he remembers taking them, and his grandfather's farm butted up against the Dan River Gorge. And so he used to take hikers down into the gorge and up and over the Pinnacles when he was a teenager. But his main job was at night going into the barn and saying, no smoking in the barn. You cannot smoke in the barn. And he'll say to me things like, well, they were city folks. They don't know about hay and cigarettes and fire. When I first started poking around down there, people would say to me, well, you should probably talk to Ralph Barnard, but he's kind of crusty, a little difficult. And I don't know which Ralph Barnard they were talking about because it wasn't the Ralph Barnard that I met. I mean, it took a little bit to figure out how to connect with him because he and his wife Hope don't have email, they don't have social media, they actually don't have internet in their home, and they when I called, they thought I was a telemarketer, so they hung up on me, and so I wrote him a letter, and that worked. I went old school, wrote him a letter, and then they were happy for me to come. And I've been to the Barnard house, I don't know, 3 or 4 times, and we exchanged birthday greetings and Christmas cards and all that. And Ralph has driven me all over the Kibler Valley, which is the Dan River Gorge, in his SUV. And there were moments when I wished he would have let me drive, because he's not the youngest guy, and we we're driving along, and he wanted to show me a view, and there's between the road and the view was a cornfield, and Ralph just turned and drove through the cornfield, and already harvested corn, but still, and then we kind of got right up to the edge, and I wanted to say, Ralph, close enough, but and then he would tell me this whole story. He's just been so sweet to me over the years, and he still lives in the house that his grandfather raised him in, and the only difference is that when the hikers were coming, it was a clapboard house, and now it's a brick house because Ralph was a brick mason, and he bricked it up at some point in the 50s. So when I go and sit on the front porch, it's the same front porch that those hikers were sitting on. And on my second visit, Ralph said, well, you want to see some pictures? I have some pictures. Okay, I'm a historian. I wanted to see the pictures. And so I said, sure. So he comes out with a shoebox full of photographs from the early history of the AT that only the Barnards had ever seen, nobody else. So, and I said, can I scan those? And he said, sure, that'd be fine. So I have those photos now, and they're amazing photos of a big group of PATC hikers standing in front of the house, Myron Avery in the middle with his measuring wheel, and from 1940 and stuff like that. So that's really great. And then the other person who I've become really close to is Doug Bell and his wife Arlene. And Doug was raised also by his grandfather, and he's not old enough to remember the hikers or the trail, but his grandfather talked about it nonstop, and he took me to his grandfather's home place, and showed me where the trail used to go across their property, and in particular how his grandfather had rerouted the trail so that it would go right past his front door. And he'd kind of gone along the edge of the farm, and he went out and moved the trail markers. It was the old tin trail markers. Moved the trail markers so hikers would go down between his chicken house and his tool shed and literally come right past the front door. And he did. I said, so why did he do that? Well, he was a gregarious guy. He liked to talk to the hikers. Said, they're from all kinds of different places. It'd be, fun to chat with them, sell them some eggs or some milk or something like that. And that's just the way it was in the 1930s and the 1940s. You could move the trail markers for your own convenience, and nobody was checking. So, and Doug and Arlene, you know, I've been in their home again, I don't know how many times, and I just saw them 2 weeks ago when I was down in Floyd, and you know, it's just been really wonderful to be accepted into this community of people for whom the Appalachian Trail is still part of their lives, even though it left 70 years ago. And their children and grandchildren remember it in the same way, because these older folks are telling their children and grandchildren, well, you know, the Appalachian Trail used to come right across our property, or your grandfather used to pole people across the New River in Redbird, which was the name of their little ferry boat. And so to me, as a historian, one of the most wonderful parts of this experience as a researcher and about writing about it and just wandering around in that part of the state is how alive the Appalachian Trail is, and how much it meant and still means to all those folks. And they wish everybody remembered that the trail used to run through their part of the state. But in the end, the only thing that really matters to them is that they remember. So that's my overview of the book. I got a whole long book about it. Well, not that long. You can see it's kind of short. And some of those photographs that, you know, were in Ralph's shoebox, or that Sally Dixon Riggs pulled out of a folder, they're in the book as well. So that's the story of the what I started calling Virginia's Lost Appalachian Trail. So what would you like to know? That was a quick overview. Yes?
What happened to the ferry?
What happened to the ferry? It's a great question. So Charlie Dixon continued running that ferry until the late 1950s, and then the state built a bridge, and that was the end of the ferry. So, and it's called Dixons Ferry Bridge. So you could, and right, the trail came to the river right where the bridge is, and then turned right and went downstream, because the New River flows north. Went downstream for half a mile and came to the Dixon's house. So if you're ever there, you just turn down, and it's called Dixons Ferry Lane. You go down Dixons Ferry Lane. There's a white house with a green roof. That's the old Dixon home place. What up? Yeah. Yeah, there is a trail over the Pinnacles of Dan. You can do it yourself. The valley, the Kibler Valley, is now owned by a Scandinavian power company, because the city of Danville built a couple of diversion dams for power purposes in the valley, flooding out a couple of the waterfalls, but not others, because there's some spectacular waterfalls there. And it's also a really popular kayaking area, because they do water releases from the dams for kayakers and in the upper Dan River. But if you contact the power company, then they will give you a code for the gate and like a 2-day permit to go in and hike it. If you're going north, it's easier if you're going north to get to the summit. You could, like Buzz Lightyear, do Falling with Style going down the other way if you wanted to, and then it goes across the river, and then up the east wall of the gorge. Hikers used to take what was called the Indian Ladder, and it was a place where Cherokee had cut handholds in a rock face like this, not straight, but just like that. And all the hiking guides from the period of time when the trail was there all say in bold, like all capital letters with exclamation points, "If wet, do not attempt." Well, the Indian Ladder is now closed, because on that side of the gorge is a resort where, if you are willing to spend $450 for a night in a hotel room, you can stay at the Primland Resort, and they own that property. And one of their guests actually attempted the Indian Ladder while wet and was really severely injured. And so they've now prohibited hiking there, but you can go up and over the Pinnacles. You just need a permit.
You know if Myron ever actually measured the entire trail with that wheel? That's what they said.
So they say. So everybody says. I've never seen the documentation showing that he was at every single point, but I'm not going to dispute it, only because Gene Stevenson said he did, and I trust Gene Stevenson. Fair, Gwen, that you would, yeah. So
And nobody was willing to say, no, he didn't measure every part of it.
no matter what, he got at least 95% out of it, and much of it more than once. Must have been more than one. But yeah, he would send these letters to people that, you know, to like a club in New England or in Tennessee or whatever. In your most recent letter, you said that the section from here to there was 6.35 miles. I went and measured it. It's 6.25 miles. Please correct your notes from now on. You know, because he was a stickler's stickler.
Died young.
Yeah, he's only 52. He's only 52. And in the PATC archives, there's an oral history with his youngest son, Hal, the one who was complaining about having to be driving around. And Hal was with him the day he died. And what he said, and Hal was in his 80s when this oral history was done. And he said the Avery family had a history of heart trouble. And at least one of Myron's brothers had died of a heart attack. And he'd had several heart attacks in the last years before he died. And in the 1950s, the medical prescription for heart trouble was rest. And Myron Avery was not somebody who was going to rest. He had a different motor. So he walked himself to death in that sense. Other questions? Things you want to know about this section of trail that, because it really vanished. I mean, when 1952 comes along and they say, okay, we're done with that section. A new trail guide came out for 1953, and the old trail wasn't mentioned. And so then every hiker from then on had no way of knowing that it had been there unless somebody told them that it was there. And so it really just kind of vanished out of people's knowledge, unless they were from there or had hiked that section. So, like Mildred Norman and Richard Lamb, they hiked that section because they did their through hike in 1952, and you know, Gene Espy and Chester Jingalewski and Earl Schaefer, they all hiked through there in 1951 and 1948, and the Kilpatricks. I am always a booster of Mary Kilpatrick, the first woman to hike every step of the Appalachian Trail. Let's just remember. They hiked through there as well. So she was a section hiker, but still the first woman to hike every step of the trail. Great answer to a trivia question. It's all about how you word it. Not who was the first woman to hike the Appalachian Trail alone, that would be Emma Gatewood, but the first woman to hike every step of the Appalachian Trail, that would be Mary Kilpatrick. And the first through hiker, female through hiker, would be Mildred Norman. So it's all how you word it. Other questions? Yeah.
So how many total miles was relocated, and how
Great
much
question.
of that do you think today would be you'd be able to find and follow?
So 300 miles of the trail, which at the time was 15% of the whole trail, because it was 2050. It's 15% of the whole trail, and so the Iron Mountain Trail section is, I think it's around 130 miles. That's easily hiked. East of the New River, I mean, if you took a trail guide from then, you could still hike all of it. A lot of it was road walking on old gravel roads, but that was typical of the AT in the 1930s. Huge swaths of the trail were road walk on gravel roads, dirt roads, and so you could still follow it. And there's a bicycle group in Floyd County that has created the Tour de Floyd, from a winery in the north end of the county to a winery in the south end of the county. It's about 60 miles, and as much as possible of that route is on the old AT, because it's so much of it was road walking. And there are sections, like if you take the Blue Ridge Parkway and you get to the Blue Ridge Music Center, which is pretty close to the North Carolina border, Fisher's Peak is there. The trail actually crossed into North Carolina for about 10 miles and then looped back into Virginia and headed up to Galax. And so Fisher's Peak, it went into North Carolina to go over Fisher's Peak because there was a resort there, like a day resort, called Norvale Crags, which is, I've never been able to find a picture of it, burned in the 50s and in the late 50s. But like when they declared that section of trail complete, there was hoopla. I mean, the governor of Virginia, the governor of North Carolina, 3 of the 4 senators from Virginia and North Carolina, along with Myron Avery and several people from the ATC and the Roanoke Club, all came to this place called Norvale Crags, and they did a sort of like golden spike ceremony where they put up the final the final trail marker up there on Fisher's Peak. And so the trail network on Fisher's Peak is really good because it's part of the Blue Ridge Parkway Park. And so you can hike some of that. All right, well, if you have no further questions, but you would like to read the book, I have copies. Thank you all so much for coming. And thanks again to Julie for organizing. Wandering out yonder.
All right, thanks for joining us today, guys, as we learned a whole lot about the Virginia Lost Appalachian Trail. Learned a whole lot about some history of the Appalachian Trail, and what was the most, I guess the coolest thing to me was the warmth of the way that Mills Kelly explained the story, and that how it impacted the people who were a part of the original trail. Just so interesting, and loved hearing that part of the story. So anyhow, guys, if you get a chance, we have a signed copy.
We do, and we look forward to getting into this.
Yeah. He has a new book out, which is called Virginia's Lost Appalachian Trail, and I'm pretty sure you can go through the Appalachian Trail Museum website.
I will post links below.
Yep.
I will post links to his podcast, which you should also check out. I mean, again, lots of information, great people to talk to. We spent the afternoon talking and meeting some fantastic people.
And again, just so much warmth, and
The community. It's
the
again about the
community is
community.
just a huge community of
Yep.
people. Yep. So anyhow, guys, thanks for watching, and we hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you later. Bye.
So this is the only place that you are going to find on the entire Appalachian Trail that they actually encourage you to feed the wildlife. This is the donation box outside of the AT Museum, and we encourage you to feed the bear.